Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to have a look at the various pieces of evidence that help us understand why or help us know why the continents have drifted. How can we prove that once upon a time the continents were all joined together, especially as we were not there to see it? So I'm going to look at 5 pieces of evidence, and you should use these to both identify the evidence in the Google document and then try to explain in as much detail how that piece of evidence can be used to come to the conclusion that the continents have indeed drifted apart, as you will have been taught in class already. So our first piece of evidence is continental jigsaw pieces, and that would be what I would title it. So how do the continental jigsaw pieces help us understand? Well, if we look very closely, we can see, especially South America and Africa, that the shape of the coasts of those two continents fit quite neatly. Indeed, actually, we can also fit Antarctica into the east coast of Africa, and we can slot India in there as well. Up here, we can see that Arabia joins nicely with the northeastern part of Africa, and that Australia, if rotated around, actually fits against the coast of Antarctica. Now, it's not perfect evidence, and the reason it's not perfect is they don't perfectly fit, because actually, obviously, what happens along the edges of coasts is erosion from the ocean, which is a theme you'll have learnt about in S1. And because the coasts in the millions of years since these continents separated have eroded, as we can see in this area here, that's all land that no longer exists, as we can see over here as well, then actually that does seem to suggest that there's not a perfect fit. But it is a reasonable piece of evidence, and it's the evidence that was first used to come up with the theory by Alfred Wegener, who was the man that introduced this idea that the continents must have all been joined together once upon a time. Okay, so now what you want to do with that is write a full description and explanation about how the continents, being jigsaw pieces that can fit together, why that is evidence, and maybe use some of the examples of continents in your answer, but also explain why it's not perfect evidence. Right, your second piece of evidence that you're going to want to write about, if you've chosen continental jigsaw pieces as your first, is the idea of fossils. So let's just have a little look at another slide to explore this in a bit more detail. Right, if we have a look at fossils across the world, we can find very similar fossils in very different places. If I, for example, was to go to this area of South America, I would find the fossil remains of this creature here, the Cynognathus, okay, which looks a little bit like a giant lizard. Could also go to the middle part of Africa and find exactly the same fossils of these creatures. Now, these are creatures that have died out a long, long time ago, more than 65 million years ago, and their remains were fossilized. And this creature inhabited the same part of the world because, generally speaking, most creatures on the planet only inhabit certain geographic areas. They're adapted to that environment. Now, this creature cannot swim across oceans, so the question is, how can a fossil in Africa be identical to the same creature of a fossil found in South America when they are separated by a massive ocean in between? Because today, there is a massive ocean between Africa and South America, called the Atlantic Ocean. Well, the reason, of course, is that once upon a time, these two continents were joined, and this creature roamed in this area of the world. We can see that with other creatures. For example, this creature here roamed in this particular area, and that's why its remains, in this case it's a fossilized fern, can both be found in Australia, Antarctica, India, Madagascar, Africa, and South America. The same fossilized remains of the same plant is found in all of these continents, even though they're all separated by oceans. So our second piece of evidence is fossilized evidence. Now, it is much better than our first piece of evidence of the jigsaw theory because it would be very difficult, or it would be unexpected to find the same creature, identically the same creature in different continents. Certainly, based on the evidence of the 21st century, the creatures we have on planet Earth, most creatures are located in just certain areas of the planet. Okay, our third piece of evidence is to do with geology and rocks. Okay, now this is where our evidence starts to get very strong. If I stand here in the United Kingdom, in Scotland, I can pick up a rock from a beach or not chip off a rock off a cliff and find that it's got exactly the same chemical properties and the same minerals and metals in it as a rock up here in Norway, a rock across here in Greenland, and actually another rock over here in the north coast of Canada, in today's North America. Now, rocks are a bit like animals. They're only found in certain areas. And if I find a rock that has an identical set of chemicals, minerals, and metals in it, then that would indicate to me that once upon a time, that rock was created in the same place on the planet. Clearly today, because of continental drift, these rocks have drifted apart and are now found in different areas. So that's my third piece of evidence. Okay, the final piece of evidence is something very different from the other pieces of evidence. This is to do with things we can see today, animals in our landscape. Now, one example is this particular creature here. The kiwi, the emu, the rhea, and the ostrich, and the cassowary. Now, these 5 birds are, from an evolutionary point of view, identical. They come from the same ancestor 65 million years ago. And the ancestor of all birds, actually, on the planet are the dinosaurs. These 5 birds have a common ancestor. So if we go back in time, we will find a dinosaur 65 million years ago, which survived the impact of the meteor and evolved into 5 different types of birds. Now, the thing about these birds, which is remarkable, is none of them can fly. And why that's significant is obviously any creature that can fly can be found anywhere on the planet because they can fly between the different regions. Flightless birds, like the 5 birds we have here, like the ostrich and the emu, clearly cannot move and they cannot swim across oceans. So how can a bird that cannot fly be found on different continents of our planet separated by oceans? And the answer to that question is that obviously all these pieces of land of which these 5 birds are today found were once joined together in a supercontinent that we now know is called Pangaea. And the dinosaur which evolved into these 5 was living in the areas where these birds are found. And when the continent split, that dinosaur was separated, and then over time its ancestors evolved into slightly different birds that all look a little bit different, and that's to do with the climates of the different areas shown on the map. But they all have the same common ancestor. So our final piece of evidence is flightless birds. And you want to do with this final piece of evidence is explain, maybe using some names and the continents which the birds are found, like the rhea in South America, the ostrich in Africa, and the emu in Australia. Those 3 actually look very similar to each other in many ways, not just the long leg, but the powerful legs, and the obvious fact that none of them can fly. Okay, you want to go ahead now and use the bits of evidence to complete the task that goes with this particular tutorial.